think our native people in North America are about the luckiest people because they know about life. It's taught from generation to generation. All that, our people knew that it was part of our culture.
Before Hollywood knew his name, he spent nearly 3 decades breaking his back on the Vancouver docks. He didn't step in front of a movie camera until he was 60 years old. He had 0 acting lessons, no headshots, and no Hollywood agent.
I think we have to pattern our life to the modern way of living today in order to survive. If we carried on our own way, we have to kind of leave our culture for a while. Our white brothers wouldn't understand our culture.
Yet, within a decade, this former longshoreman and First Nations chief silenced a stadium of 32,000 people, outacted Dustin Hoffman, matched Clint Eastwood beat for beat, and landed a historic Oscar nomination. No one believed these Chief Dan George stories until they watched this. Start fascinating. The boy whose name was stolen. Long before the world applauded his quiet, gravelly voice on cinema screens, Canada tried to silence him before he could ever speak. Born in 1899 on the Burrard Indian Reserve in North Vancouver, he entered the world with a name passed down through generations of Coast Salish ancestry. Geswanuth Slahut. To his family and the Tsleil-Waututh people, that name was a living thread connecting him to the ancient shorelines, the rich cedar forests, and the deep oral traditions of his ancestors. It meant thunder coming up over the land from the water, a title carrying weight and identity. But in the eyes of an expanding 20th century nation determined to force its indigenous populations into total cultural submission, that name was something to be scrubbed completely out of existence. At just 5 years old, little Geswanuth was torn away from his home and delivered into the harsh clinical machinery of the residential school system. The institution assigned to break his spirit was St. Paul's Indian Residential School in North Vancouver, run under federal mandate. The objective of these schools was neither subtle nor secret. They were explicitly designed to assimilate Indigenous children by methodically stripping away their heritage, their family bonds, and their mother tongue. The moment he crossed that threshold, speaking the language of his ancestors, the rich, expressive Coast Salish dialect became an absolute crime. Speaking a single native word meant swift and severe physical punishment from administrators. Then came the final act of bureaucratic erasure. His true identity was stripped away on official paperwork and replaced with a plain, easily digestible English substitute. Geswanuth Slahut was officially discarded, and in his place stood Dan George. For 11 long years, young Dan endured the cold, unyielding rigidity of the institution. Children were forced into grueling manual labor, subjected to strict military-style discipline, and systematically taught that their heritage was a source of shame. The system was meticulously crafted to ensure that by the time a child left, they were completely detached from their roots, unable to navigate their own native culture, and conditioned to exist as second-class citizens in modern society. It was built to produce broken, compliant workers who would melt quietly into the margins of Canada without making a sound. Yet, despite the deep emotional scar tissue and the relentless government efforts to reshape his entire identity, the spirit of Geswanuth Slahut never truly died inside him. He absorbed the English language and learned to navigate the white man's world out of sheer necessity, but he kept his true heritage buried deep where no school administrator could ever reach it. He learned how to endure quietly, holding on to his core dignity while waiting out the storm. Canada had stolen his childhood name, but it had failed to take his soul. It had merely forced it into hiding. How do you erase a man's name without erasing his spirit? 27 years on the docks. When Dan George walked out of St. Paul's Residential School at 16, he wasn't greeted by opportunities or open doors. He was a young Indigenous man in early 20th century Canada, a country that legally viewed him as a ward of the state without the basic right to vote. White-collar jobs were completely off-limits, and professional avenues simply didn't exist for people from his reserve. Survival wasn't a philosophical question, it was a daily physical grind. So Dan took the only work available to a man with strong hands and a quiet resolve. He went down to the brutal, unforgiving waterfront of Vancouver to earn his bread. For 27 straight years, from 1919 to 1946, Dan George spent his life on the docks as a longshoreman and lumberjack. Long before modern labor laws, automated cranes, or safety protocols transformed the maritime industry, loading cargo was a hazardous, bone-crushing endeavor. Men were pitted against giant timber logs, heavy industrial steel, and massive crates of raw materials in all weather conditions. Rain, freezing winds, and heavy fog were constant companions along the Pacific Northwest coast, turning wooden docks into slick, lethal skating rinks where one misplaced step meant falling into icy waters or getting crushed under a slipping load. Day after day, month after month, Dan stood on those icy decks and muddy shores, hauling lumber that weighed hundreds of pounds. He swung axes in the dense timber stands, operated primitive winches, and manually manhandled giant timber booms across the water. The work was so physically demanding that it permanently altered a man's body. Hands became thick, calloused pads, shoulders grew perpetually heavy, and lower backs were subjected to continuous, grinding pressure. Thousands of men broke under the strain within a few years, turning to alcohol or abandoning the docks entirely. But Dan George didn't quit. He quietly showed up every single morning, put his head down, and absorbed the brutal physical punishment to feed his growing family. Yet, the waterfront offered more than just physical hardship. It was a brutal social arena defined by racial tension and prejudice. Indigenous longshoremen were often handed the most dangerous, filthy jobs on the docks, while simultaneously being paid lower wages than their white counterparts. They faced constant harassment and quiet systemic exclusion. Despite these harsh dynamics, Dan earned something rare among his fellow workers: absolute, unquestioned respect. He didn't demand it through loud words or confrontation. He commanded it through an unbreakable work ethic, immaculate reliability, and a calm, immovable presence. When the winds blew hardest and the loads shifted dangerously in the holds of cargo ships, men wanted Dan George standing next to them because he never panicked. For nearly 3 decades, the world saw Dan George as nothing more than a nameless cog in the industrial machine of Vancouver, just another weathered native laborer hauling timber in a frayed jacket. Nobody looking at this quiet dock worker could have ever guessed that under those calloused hands and rain-soaked clothes rested the mind of a legendary orator and storyteller. He carried 27 years of hard labor in silence, building an internal reservoir of resilience that would eventually shock the world when he finally found his platform. He survived the docks, but the timber wasn't done with him yet. The broken back that unlocked a destiny. By 1946, Dan George was 47 years old. 27 years of shifting heavy timber, hauling raw iron, and enduring the damp, bone-chilling mist of the Vancouver docks had taken a heavy toll on his frame, but his body had held together through sheer strength and iron willpower. He was a battle-tested survivor of a brutal industrial system that chewed up strong men and spat them out without a second thought. But on a cold morning like any other, the unyielding law of averages on the waterfront finally caught up with him in the most violent way imaginable. While maneuvering a treacherous timber load, a massive piece of heavy lumber swung completely out of control. In a split second of mechanical failure and shifting weight, the massive beam pinned Dan against the decking under its crushing force. The physical impact was horrifying. Bone shattered instantly under relentless pressure, muscle tore away, and his spine absorbed a devastating shock that dropped him to the floor. In an industry where a major workplace accident usually resulted in a swift trip to the morgue, Dan miraculously survived the crushing blow. But as emergency workers stabilized his broken body, one terrifying truth became clear. His long career as a physical laborer was permanently over. His physical recovery was a grueling, agonizing ordeal that stretched over long, dark months inside a hospital ward. Medical staff worked tirelessly to stabilize his wrecked spine, but the structural damage was irreversible. His back was shattered, his walking stride was altered forever, and the raw, physical power he had relied upon to feed his family for nearly 3 decades was gone in a moment. For a proud man who had built his entire identity around hard, honest physical labor, laying helpless in a hospital bed was a psychological torment far worse than the bodily pain. To any outsider looking in, this catastrophic accident appeared to be the tragic end of an obscure, hard-scrabble life. In the middle of the 20th century, an Indigenous man in Canada with a ruined body, no formal credentials, and no financial safety net faced a grim, hopeless future. The political system was fully prepared to let men like Dan fade silently into poverty and total obscurity on his reserve. He was 47, permanently disabled, and stripped of his livelihood. Yet fate possessed a strange, hidden irony. The crushing wood that shattered Dan George's spine actually liberated him from the endless, mind-numbing labor of the Vancouver waterfront. For the first time in his adult life, he was no longer forced to work 16-hour shifts hauling lumber until his hands bled. The physical accident forced his body into rest, but it unleashed his intellect, presence, and voice. It broke the blue-collar worker to reveal the profound leader waiting underneath. Without that terrifying accident on the waterfront, Dan George almost certainly would have collapsed into an early grave as an unknown dock worker. Instead, his ruined back became the unlikely turning point of his existence. He returned home to the Tsleil-Waututh Nation not as a broken victim asking for pity, but as a deeply resilient leader ready to guide his community into a new era. When your body gives out, what do you do with the fire still burning inside? Leading his people in the shadows of empire. Stripped of his ability to work the docks, Dan George turned his focus entirely back home to the Tsleil-Waututh Nation on the Burrard Inlet. He refused to sit in a corner and let injury dictate the rest of his life. In 1951, his community recognized his quiet wisdom, unyielding integrity, and deep moral compass, electing him as chief of the Tsleil-Waututh. For the next 12 years, from 1951 to 1963, he carried the formidable responsibility of guiding his people through one of the most oppressive political eras in modern Canadian history. Being an Indigenous leader in the 50s was not a matter of formal ceremonies or political glamour. It was a grueling uphill battle against systemic oppression. Under the strict enforcement of the Indian Act, Indigenous people were treated as legal minors, denied basic civil liberties, and subjected to federal surveillance. Federal agents held vast authority over reserve life, controlling everything from resource access to basic economic development. Chief Dan George found himself navigating a complex landscape of bureaucratic control, systemic poverty, and institutionalized prejudice, all while fighting to preserve the cultural identity of his small community against relentless assimilation pressure. Despite these immense structural hurdles, Chief Dan George led with remarkable grace, patience, and resolve. He advocated tirelessly for better housing, improved local infrastructure, access to proper education, and the protection of ancestral lands along the Burrard Inlet. He knew that open hostility against government agencies would lead directly to immediate pushback and gridlock, so he mastered the art of calm, principled negotiation. He spoke with a quiet, undeniable authority that forced federal administrators to listen, refusing to back down on fundamental rights while keeping doors open for dialogue. Beyond political negotiations, his primary mission was restoring the sense of pride that residential schools and economic disenfranchisement had worked so hard to strip away from his people. He reintroduced traditional Coast Salish songs, storytelling, and cultural practices to the younger generation, encouraging them to hold their heads high despite societal hostility. He acted as a mediator, a spiritual anchor, and a protective shield for his community, showing through his own personal conduct that dignity was an internal strength no government regulation could ever revoke. For 12 long years, Chief Dan George served on the front lines of local advocacy, completely unknown to the wider world outside British Columbia. He never sought personal fame, wealth, or political power. He simply wanted his people to survive, prosper, and be treated with basic human dignity on their own ancestral land. By the time he stepped down from his role as chief in 1963, he had earned the deep, enduring reverence of his community and built a reputation as a peacemaker who could bridge two vastly different worlds. He was a chief to his people, but to Hollywood, he was about to become an accident. The accidental actor at age 60. In the late 50s, while still serving as chief of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, Dan George stepped into a world he had never once contemplated: show business. He didn't move to Los Angeles, hire an agent, or spend hours practicing monologues in front of a mirror. He was nearly 60 years old, recovering from a broken back, and simply trying to earn a little extra income for his family. He joined a local country and western musical group called the Rhythm Rangers with his sons, playing the bass guitar and performing at local community halls across British Columbia. He was content making music for small audiences, entirely unaware that television producers were quietly searching for someone exactly like him. During this period, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, was casting for a television drama series titled Radisson and later Caribou Country. In the late 50s, mainstream film and television were dominated by white actors in dark makeup, a practice known as redface, to play indigenous roles. Native characters were routinely reduced to silent, bloodthirsty caricatures or stereotypical background props. However, the producers of Caribou Country made a rare decision for the era. They wanted a genuine indigenous actor to play the recurring role of Old Antoine, an elderly native man living in rural British Columbia. Finding an older indigenous person comfortable standing in front of studio lights and television cameras in 1960 was an almost impossible task due to decades of institutional marginalization. When casting directors reached out to local communities, Dan George's name came up. He stepped onto the set with no formal acting classes, no experience with scripts, and no knowledge of camera angles. What he brought instead was something Hollywood couldn't teach: 60 years of authentic, lived experience. He brought the weight of 27 years on the docks, the solemnity of a tribal chief, and the quiet grace of a man who had survived the residential school system. When the cameras rolled, Dan George didn't act in the traditional theatrical sense. He didn't project his voice or deliver theatrical gestures. Instead, he simply spoke with his natural, gravelly cadence, letting his deep, expressive eyes and calm posture convey emotion. He presented indigenous humanity on television screens without exaggeration or performance tricks. Audiences across Canada were immediately captivated by his screen presence. What was supposed to be a small, temporary television gig quickly expanded into a recurring role that lasted for years. Without intending to, Chief Dan George had shattered the established mold of how Indigenous people were portrayed on screen. He proved that quiet authenticity was far more powerful than forced drama, and that a man in his 60s could embark on an entirely new career path without altering a single aspect of who he was. By the mid-60s, he had become a recognized figure on Canadian television, but the broader world had still barely glimpsed the monumental power of his voice. A local TV gig is one thing. Silencing an entire nation is another. The day he silenced Empire Stadium. On July 1, 1967, Canada celebrated the centennial anniversary of its Confederation. Across the country, massive crowds gathered for fireworks, parades, and patriotic festivities marking 100 years of nationhood. In Vancouver, the epicenter of the celebration was Empire Stadium, where 32,000 cheerful spectators packed the stands under a sea of red and white flags. The atmosphere was electrifying, filled with brass bands, cheering families, and political dignitaries praising the nation's historic progress. As part of the official program, organizers invited Chief Dan George to take the stage and deliver a performance. They expected a colorful, ceremonial speech celebrating unity, harmony, and national pride. Instead, Chief Dan George stepped up to the microphone, looked out at the massive sea of faces, and completely turned the nation's birthday party on its head. He was accompanied by his wife, Amy, who wept softly beside him as he began to speak. He did not yell, rant, or display anger. In his signature calm, raspy, and deeply resonant voice, he delivered a self-penned soliloquy titled "Lament for Confederation," a raw, devastating eulogy for the lost lands, broken treaties, and shattered traditions of North America's First Nations. "How long have I known you, O Canada?" he began, his voice echoing clearly through the stadium speakers. 100 years? Yes, 100 years. And many, many seacoasts before the white man came, I knew you in your wildness, in your freedom. He went on to describe the brutal reality of colonization from the perspective of his people. He spoke of watching his ancestral lands stripped away, his people's spirit broken, and their children forced into residential schools. "I have seen my freedom disappear like the salmon before the ice," he said, delivering a harrowing indictment of the very century the crowd had gathered to celebrate. As his words settled over Empire Stadium, a remarkable transformation occurred. The roaring cheers vanished entirely. The brass instruments fell silent. 32,000 people sat frozen in their seats, stunned into absolute silence by the profound weight of his truth. He did not cast insults or preach hatred. He invited the audience to feel the unbearable grief of a displaced culture. "O God in heaven," he proclaimed, "give me back the freedom of the shadow of the deep forest, or at least give me the love of my fellow man, so I can pass through this life without fear." When he concluded his speech with a call for his young people to rise up, regain their dignity, and reclaim their place in society, the stadium erupted into a thunderous, standing ovation. He had taken a moment designed for nationalist celebration and transformed it into a landmark turning point in Canadian cultural history. The lament for Confederation was broadcast across the country, searing itself into the national consciousness and proving that Dan George was no longer just a local television actor, he was a moral giant whose voice could stop a nation in its tracks. Hollywood took notice, but they had no idea what they were about to ask him to do. The role Hollywood legends ran away from. By 1969, director Arthur Penn was preparing to shoot Little Big Man, a sweeping anti-revisionist Western satire based on Thomas Berger's acclaimed novel. The movie aimed to completely invert traditional Hollywood Western tropes, painting the U.S. cavalry as ruthless invaders and the Cheyenne as a deeply humane, wise, and spiritual society. The entire emotional anchor of the film rested on the character of Old Lodge Skins, a blind Cheyenne chief who acts as the adoptive father and moral compass to Dustin Hoffman's character, Jack Crabb. Finding the right actor for this central, complex role was an absolute necessity for the studio. However, casting Old Lodge Skins proved to be an exhausting, multi-year nightmare for the production team. Major Hollywood studios were terrified of casting an unknown Indigenous person in such a prominent role, fearing it would harm box office sales. Instead, the filmmakers initially sought out established A-list Hollywood legends. Legendary actor Laurence Olivier was approached, but he turned down the part due to scheduling conflicts and reservations about playing an Indigenous figure. Marlon Brando was pursued aggressively, but he flatly rejected the role, feeling the production didn't go far enough in its political commentary. Paul Scofield was offered the part, but he too declined. With production deadlines looming and 3 cinematic titans turning the role down, Arthur Penn made a radical move. On the advice of Canadian casting contacts who had seen Caribou Country and heard of his electric lament for Confederation speech, Penn flew north to meet Chief Dan George. At 70 years old, living quietly on his reserve in North Vancouver, Dan George was offered the role of a lifetime. He accepted it, stepping onto a massive multi-million-dollar Hollywood set opposite Dustin Hoffman, who was then fresh off his iconic star-making performances in The Graduate and Midnight Cowboy. Far from being intimidated by Hoffman's intense method acting or the high-pressure Hollywood production, Dan George delivered a masterclass in quiet authority. He approached Old Lodge skins not as a theatrical exercise, but as an authentic reflection of his own elders, ancestors, and life experiences. His performance brought an effortless humor, deep warmth, and tragic dignity to the screen. In scenes where he shared the screen with Hoffman, it was the non-actor in his 70s who regularly commanded the frame, providing the heart, humor, and soul that grounded the entire epic story. When Little Big Man premiered in late 1970, it was a massive critical and commercial success, and Chief Dan George's performance shocked film critics across the globe. Reviewers hailed his portrayal as the most authentic, heartwarming, and groundbreaking depiction of an Indigenous person ever put on film. He didn't just play Old Lodge skins, he elevated the entire Western genre, proving that an elderly First Nations man with no formal acting background could outshine Hollywood royalty simply by being himself. When the cameras stopped rolling, the Academy had to face a truth it had ignored for 4 decades: the Oscar, Clint Eastwood, and endeavoring to persevere. When the nominations for the 43rd Academy Awards were officially announced in early 1971, Hollywood history was permanently rewritten. Among the nominees for Best Supporting Actor was Chief Dan George for his legendary performance as Old Lodge Skins in Little Big Man. He became the very first Indigenous North American actor ever nominated for a competitive acting Oscar. For an industry that had spent nearly 4 decades using white actors in redface and reducing Native peoples to nameless cinematic villains, his nomination was a seismic, long-overdue reckoning. Although he lost the Oscar to John Mills for Ryan's Daughter, Chief Dan George walked away as the undisputed cultural victor of the awards season. He won the prestigious National Society of Film Critics Award and New York Film Critics Circle Award, turning an obscure septuagenarian longshoreman into an international icon virtually overnight. Yet, unlike most actors who get swept up in the glittering madness of Hollywood fame, Dan remained completely unmoved by the glamour. After attending star-studded galas in Los Angeles, he quietly returned home to his simple house on the Burrard Inlet Reserve, continuing to chop his own firewood, spend time with his grandchildren, and live according to his traditional values. His legendary status caught the eye of another Hollywood giant, Clint Eastwood. In 1976, Eastwood cast Dan George in his landmark Western masterpiece, The Outlaw Josey Wales. Dan was assigned the role of Lone Woti, an aging, displaced Cherokee man who joins Eastwood's titular character on a dark journey across a post-Civil War landscape. The dynamic between Eastwood's silent, lethal gunfighter and Dan's dry, humorous, and deeply philosophical character created one of the most memorable double acts in Western cinema history. Dan delivered his lines with a bone-dry comedic timing that blew audiences away. In one of the most famous scenes in cinema history, Lone Woti recounts how government officials gave his people speeches telling them to endeavor to persevere. With a twinkle in his eye and a completely straight face, Dan delivers the iconic punchline, "We thought about it for a long time, endeavor to persevere. And when we had thought about it, we went to the chief and said, equal story. We thought about it some more, and then we declared war." His performance stole the entire movie, demonstrating that his dramatic success in Little Big Man was no fluke. He proved that he possessed world-class comedic instincts and a magnetic screen presence that matched Clint Eastwood frame for frame. Throughout the 70s, Dan George used his global platform to advocate tirelessly for Indigenous rights, environmental stewardship, and cultural preservation. He authored 2 best-selling books of poetry and prose, My Heart Soars and My Very First Taste of Freedom, leaving behind a rich literary legacy alongside his filmography. He passed away peacefully on September 23, 1981, at the age of 82 in Vancouver, the very city where he had broken his back on the docks decades earlier. He lived enough lifetimes for 5 men, transforming from a silenced child into a revered chief, a national voice, and a global legend. So, how do you measure a life that didn't even truly start until the age of 60? The magic that worked. How do you measure a life that didn't even truly start until the age of 60? To the Canadian government that stripped away his birth name at age 5, he was supposed to be erased, assimilated, and forgotten. To the industrial docks of Vancouver, he was just another anonymous laborer whose back was meant to be broken under the relentless weight of swinging timber. To an early Hollywood film industry obsessed with stereotypes, he was never supposed to exist at all. Yet, Geswanuth Slahoot defied every single script the world wrote for him. He endured 27 years of crushing manual labor, survived a catastrophic accident that shattered his spine, led his people through 12 years of systemic oppression, and walked onto movie sets at age 60 with zero formal training, only to outact the grandest cinematic legends of his generation. He never changed his tone, never wore a costume that didn't fit his soul, and never altered who he was to appease an audience. Whether standing before 32,000 silent spectators at Empire Stadium or sharing a scene with Clint Eastwood, he brought the quiet, unyielding power of his ancestors with him. He proved to the world that authenticity is infinitely more powerful than acting, and that a voice silenced for decades can still grow loud enough to shake a nation. In Little Big Man, his character famously uttered a phrase that would define his entire improbable journey. Sometimes the magic works, sometimes it doesn't. For Chief Dan George, the magic didn't just work. It reshaped history, shattered stereotypes, and left behind an enduring legacy that will echo for generations to come. Geswanuth Slahoot lived many lives. Laborer, leader, actor, icon, proving it's never too late to make history and make your voice heard. Hit subscribe to never miss an incredible untold story.